Welcome to the Alcove. I'm Mark Malero. My guest today is Mark Pesce. He is a technology futurist, writer, researcher, and teacher, in addition to being one of the pioneers of virtual reality. He's here in New York speaking on technology at the Personal Democracy Forum, and it's great to have him on the program with us today. Mark, welcome.
Thank you very much.
You recently said that you don't see yourself as much as a technology futurist as much as you do a technology presentist.
Right.
I wonder if you can tell me what you mean by that.
Well, futurism is people who get paid a lot of money for saying in 20 years, and I realized that it's an excellent scam, because in 20 years, well, part of your audience is going to be dead and the rest won't remember what you said. What I do is, in general, I actually look at things that people are doing now. There's this lovely quote from William Gibson: "The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed." And in fact, part of my research work has been studying how things that are here get distributed around. That's been part of my research work. So you can take a look at something that may be going on here, and then how does it spread? What does it mean when that behavior spreads to a much larger group of people? And so I call myself a presentist because really what I'm doing is trying to find these examples in the present, and then not so much extrapolate, but just take a look at, okay, the process of growth as the behavior grows and becomes more widespread. What does that mean? What are the implications for that? I don't think of that as futurism because I don't have to put on the fancy sort of turban, and I don't have to use a crystal ball because it's actually right there.
Right. And where are we right now? People talk about, this whole thing about Web 2.0, 3.0. Are we somewhere in the middle of that? How would you sort of look at right now?
If I'm going to be very honest with you, I think that this Web 1.0, 2.0, 3.0 thing, it's a bit of a shorthand that doesn't really do the process justice. The thing that I've really started to become clear on in the last couple of months of my work is an understanding that, in this fundamental sense, what happened was what we call the Web 1.0 period is we got this amazing thing. It was a toy that you unwrapped on Christmas Day that could slice, dice, make great julienne fries, but there was no user manual.
Right.
And we had to play with the toy for a long time. A long time. And every time we sort of clicked a new button and a new feature popped out, and all of a sudden it goes from being a buzzsaw to being a hairdryer and all of these different things. Then we're like, oh, okay, and someone would note that and they'd share that around. And so we built up an inventory of possibilities. And the Web 1.0 era was simply that. It was just simply, think, wikis were invented in 1995. They're an early web technology, but everyone thinks of them as being the quintessential Web 2.0 technology. They're not. The way we use a wiki. So it's not about the hardware and the technology. It's about the software of the culture.
Okay.
All right. And so Web 1.0 was playing with the toy. Web 2.0 is us actually going, okay, we have some understanding of what this toy is. And this toy isn't a publishing medium. It's a communication medium. And that's where that entire shift in emphasis came from just static web pages to now it's all about the conversation, whether it's happening on Twitter or it's happening on Facebook or it's happening through any gazillion different means.
Now, I remember seeing a conference that you had given in 2006 where you used the word hyperdistribution. Right. This idea, again, of sort of giving your work away for free, that this was sort of a critical point that, that the technology was allowing a more flatter world, as somebody like Thomas Friedman would talk about. Do you look at, when you look back at that time, have things played out the way that you thought that they would? Where are we 2 years later?
Yeah, it's obvious that things have played out, in some sense, even in a more accelerated form. How was the Alcove distributed?
On the web.
All right.
Yeah.
And so that gives you basically access to anyone who wants to see it. The thing that's in some sense changed because it's been amplified and because it's more present now versus 2 years ago where we were just starting to see the phenomenon is now this idea of social sharing has become embedded as a baseline behavior for everyone who's using all of the different network technologies, that I will immediately flip a link to you, you'll flip a link to me, and then so on and so forth. And that this behavior, which was present in 2006, isn't even noticed in 2008 because it's so much of a standard part of our behavioral kit. Okay. So hyperdistribution was the possibility for it. And now what we're seeing is that it's been taken up, it's been sucked up by the culture, and it's just part of the cultural expectation for how media work now.
And you've now focused on a term that you've used called hyperconnectivity.
Yeah.
Is that where we're heading, where, again, it's about how these technologies are connecting us, changing the way that we interact, the way we socialize?
We've seen, I guess, such an enormous growth in the connectivity. I guess the basic idea of hyperconnectivity is that we have, for as long as we've been human beings, so say at least 60,000 years, we've had innate social networks. We have this thing that's called Dunbar's number, which is based on the fact that a human being is capable of having good social relations, so close social relationships with about 150 other people. And if you look back through history, tribal size, all through history has been around 150. If it gets larger than that, it breaks up, goes to two separate tribes. And this is actually, they now know it's directly related to the amount of gray matter that we have in our brains, because chimpanzees and gorillas who have less, it's a direct correlation between the amount of gray matter they have and their tribe sizes, or their troop sizes. So we know that this concept of a social network is old, but now we have tools. Just recently, we now have tools that allow us to not just work with that 150, but also to work with many, many other people. And we're still sort of grappling with what that means, because I can have 430 friends or something on Facebook. They aren't all my real friends. They're people I know.
Right.
You're one of them, right?
Right, there you go.
So they're people that I know and I would communicate with. So we now have this idea that there's a level of connectivity and relationship that we have that is being amplified by the technology, but is in some sense also part of the thing that we are. And so we're as a culture, booting up into this capability. And so I call that hyperconnectivity. We don't really know where it's going. We know that a flash mob is one of the funnier things that can happen when all of that gets going. But we also know that you can have, Clay Shirky today was talking about a revolution in Belarus that was happening via flash mob, and it was sort of very slow speed. And you're seeing that because what you can do is you can put out a call to find the others on any particular thing, and now 500,000 people can raise their hands. So that's what we're talking about with hyperconnectivity. So it changes the scale of social relationships in some shocking ways, and because of the changes in scale, you can get changes in the quality. And
what would be some, for you, very important examples where that had a real social or political impact that you're seeing today?
There are both positive and ugly examples. So I'll start with, because this is a dial, and you can turn the dial in any number of different ways. So December of 2005, a text message went out, forwarded from mobile phone to mobile phone among the white supremacists in the Sydney area. And we have white supremacists in Australia. That was basically inviting them to come down to Cronulla Beach, which is a beach that's in the south shore of Sydney, for a beat down on the Lebs, meaning the Lebanese, because there's a large Lebanese community in the southwestern suburbs of Sydney. And 5,000 people showed up, and there was a riot that lasted 2 days. So day one was the white supremacists rioting. Then day two, the Lebanese, also forwarding a text message amongst themselves, showed up in Cronulla and had another riot. And so the hyperconnectivity there was capable of producing two very highly polar situations, and something that couldn't be diffused. So that's bog standard now. All right, that's part of what's going to happen now because we have that capability. And I don't know. I mean, we might find ways to diffuse it, but it's a capability that's now latent and is always going to pop up. On the other side of the coin, there's a city in China called Xiamen. It's about 200 km north of Shanghai. They were going to be building a production plant to make benzene there. And the Chinese are, particularly the middle-class Chinese, are already getting a little bit disturbed by the amount of pollution. There's a lot of cancer. There are a higher rate of birth defects and whatnot. And a text message started circling around Xiamen that had been circulated perhaps 1.5 million times. Rather long text message, but Chinese apparently very well suited to text messaging because it's compact. Talking about, we can't allow this plant to go forward. Please show your support. Show up at this government square on June 1st. Now, all of these messages are passing through China Telecom, and the government sees this, and they try to block the messages. But the message mutates around the filter every single time. And June 1st comes, and there's video of this up on YouTube, which is even better. And 4,000 people show up for a public protest. And the interesting thing was, although this could have ended very, very badly, in fact, the governments just sort of took a hands-off approach. They marched around the square. You can see in the YouTube video with their banners, please don't build the plant. And the interesting thing about this is that this then sparked interest from the central government, which then, put certain local officials who were obviously corrupt, because this is China, into jail, and the plant is now canceled, and the people are satisfied.
Right. Does this play into, like for instance, at this year's Personal Democracy Forum, you're giving an address, I believe it's entitled Hyperpolitics, what happens when we're all connected. I don't know if that's changed, but does it play into that idea now that this is really political? This is, again, this is social, and is that sort of the next step? We're connected, but now it's having, whether intended or unintended, political consequences.
Right. I think almost all of the consequences are unintended. We're seeing political campaigns, I mean in particular the Obama campaign, which activated built a social network and activated it. That comes, near as I can tell, out of Obama's history as a community organizer. And community organization is inherently social network, human social network based. It doesn't require a strong technology infrastructure. Mm-hmm. But he's taken that and scaled that up. So he's activated a network. He activated it particularly to win the caucuses, although it helped him a lot in the primaries. And it's going to, the network will be reactivated to bring out votes for the general election now in March, when there was a bit of a sort of lag. I think there was a couple weeks ago after he won his 10 primaries in a row, and there was a little while, I think, it was that long period, I think, before Pennsylvania and Texas, when everyone was just like, And one of his field organizers came out to Sydney, gave a little talk with a couple of other people. We were talking about politics in the digital age, and I asked him a question afterward. I said, look, you've got this social network, you've activated it. You may win the primaries, and then you'll win the general election with it. Then what? And his reaction was very interesting, because it's just like, I don't know that anyone's thought that far ahead, was his answer. And I thought that was singular, because this is not the kind of thing that you can just pick up and put down when you're done with it. And I don't think they understand that. This is the kind of thing that once it's activated now, if it chooses to stay activated, then it is active. And so the question is not so much, because the campaign has got a degree of hyperconnectivity from the bottom up to the campaign. Right. But the other thing that's going to happen is the cross-connectivity. And that's something that the campaign has no control over, because that's just natural human connectivity being in place. So you're building a network that may be strongly reinforcing itself to win the general election, which will have persistent qualities after the election. And this is now, this is going to be the 900-pound gorilla in the living room of American politics, that if this network gets charged up enough, then it can do what it wants. Now, Obama recently has given talks where he talks about his vision for what this charged up community can do. And, you know, they're noble, but I think that, in fact, beyond being able to suggest things to that network, he has no control over it. And so we're now introducing other elements into play, and that's one of the things I'm going to be touching on in the talk, which is that you can invoke these forces, but like the Sorcerer's Apprentice, once you invoke them, you can't always put them down.
That's interesting, because does that play into this idea that you use the word hyper a lot? Is that really the definition of the way that you think of hyper, this idea that it is inherently chaotic and not controllable? I mean, you've talked about the idea that we're essentially not really governable anymore, both for good and for bad. Right. Why do you specifically use the word hyper, and what's sort of the connotation that you mean with that?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of different, you know, people used super distribution to describe Napster, and this was the genesis of it. They were talking about super distribution with Napster, and I realized that BitTorrent was something beyond what Napster was. So I said, okay, super, the next one after that would be hyper. Okay. And so, okay, there's hyper distribution. And then, well, you have connectivity. Well, what happens when everyone's connected to everyone else? Well, that's hyperconnectivity. Now, I've just coined a new one last week, where I was thinking about the behaviors when someone does something interesting. That behavior, because we're all connected together, is now seen and copied widely. Well, that's mimesis, is imitating behavior. All right? Okay. So hypermimesis is what happens. And you know, I pulled out a great quote about this from Jan Chipchase, who's the anthropologist working at Nokia, studying how people in third world cultures use mobile phones. And he's the resource. He has this great quote, and he says, you know, when some hacker in India figures out a new way to add a feature to an existing common mobile phone, on Monday, by Friday, it's on the streets in Ghana. All right, that's the way the world works now. Why? Because these people are all networked together. First world, third world, developed world, no difference. It just spreads. That's hypermimesis, all right? And that's also happening now. There was a report in The Guardian last week that kids in England are using Google Maps to figure out who's got a pool in their backyard.
Oh, really? Okay.
And then they check out the houses, because they know a kid locally through their social network. They home? No. All right, go over the fence. have a party, leave bears in the swimming pool.
Oh,
all right.
boy.
Now,
Oh,
the
boy.
thing of it is that that probably would have been a local phenomenon, except it was then documented in the Guardian, posted up to Gizmodo, boing, boing, and all of this. I posted about it, all right. And so now that behavior, the other kids are going, oh, wait, we should be doing this too. Bam, 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 bam. This is what the world looks like now. Any behavior that's successful, whether by whatever criteria you want to define success, is now instantly copied, instantly replicable.
And therefore ungovernable.
Well, I mean,
difficult to govern.
Yeah, I mean, no, I mean, I don't want to come across as someone who is inherently anarchistic, and yet I look at my own work and say this is the only conclusion you can draw. And it's that it's not about governance anymore. It's probably much more about forces that are trying to maintain some sort of balance. The government, rather than trying to say, you know, this is order, it's not that. And really, governments always give you that impression. But you know, if you live in New York, and you do, and one of the reasons New York I always find New York confronting is because New York is the single most chaotic place I ever go, because it's an entirely human environment. I love New York, would never live here, all right? And I've said this all of my life. I enjoy breathing in the chaos. New Yorkers all live with it and laugh about it and crack jokes about the crazy stuff that goes on.
Okay.
I think there's something I find sort of deeply disturbing about it. And I think that the entire planet, in some sense, is going to be confronted with that the global culture will have this constant element of chaos. Now, there's beauty in that. There's disorder in that. There's no certainty in that. People are often hew to certainty, particularly when things are changing very rapidly as they are.
Right.
So there's going to be cultural consequences for all of this.
One of the things that I'm wondering, you've mentioned specifically 4 major examples of online change. You talk about YouTube, podcasting,
Right.
Wikipedia, and BitTorrent.
Right.
Are those kind of 4 pillars that are fairly consistent in terms of leading this revolution, or is that list expanding all the time?
Well, though, I mean, the interesting thing is you can sort of say, was it BitTorrent really came of age in 2003, Wikipedia maybe 2004, podcasting 2005, and what was the other one on that list? Oh, YouTube 2006. All right. Bam, 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 bam. And 2007 to 2008 is Twitter. So the list is growing longer.
And Facebook.
Oh yeah, so we'll give Facebook 2007 and Twitter 2008, just to be fair all around.
So
So you're seeing innovations, any one of which in any decade would be like, ooh, this is the big thing, and they're just popping out of the tube now. And each one of them, it takes some time to figure out what they're good for, and then they go wide. Once that behavioral reservoir of what they're good for becomes sort of strong enough to get people sucked into the value of them.
one of the things people always use these days is this idea of information overload. People talk about it all the time, almost in sort of a ubiquitous way. There is so much information out there, and one of the things that I'm wondering is there an intelligible way for sort of an average person to try to navigate some of these exciting, but as you say, inherently chaotic technologies, where trying to find personal meaning in this without getting lost in it? Sort of, again, can there be a net benefit where you say, I'm going to take the time to learn this and network and not be overwhelmed by it, to actually get personal meaning out of it?
Right. I'm going to give you a long answer here, because you're actually touching on what I think are 2 intersecting things. The first of which has to do with the distraction quality of all this technology. And this has been a persistent theme, particularly when I'm talking to educators, which I do a lot of when I'm in Australia. And, everyone says, well, the kids are so distracted, they can't think for more than a couple of minutes. I have to keep them out of the classroom because, we're trying to teach calculus and you need to be able to focus for that. And in fact, they're sort of viewing it as a binary, that you either open the classroom up and it's chaotic, or you close them down and the classroom is then disconnected from the world, which is, neither of these are really good solutions. And one of the things that has to happen in the kids, but the kids have to learn it from us, is that we have to understand how to carve out the space, the quiet, to be able to think or to not think, as well as the space where we're saying, oh, well, I'm just going full on in. Today at the conference I had Twitter open, I had a couple of web windows with live stuff that was streaming from the conference, plus email going, plus I'm trying to listen to what's going on stage. And I knew I was just sort of at the threshold of having my brains pour out my ears, because
I was just going to say, can you actually do that in an
not
intelligible
well.
way? Okay.
Not well, but you can do it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, all of these streams were worthy of me either watching or contributing to, so there was some competition there. And now if something had gotten really interesting on stage, then obviously my focus would have narrowed a little bit. And the question is whether every individual has that ability innately, whether it's something I've learned because I've been online for 20 years. These are the kinds of things, and it's very hard to think about how we can build those skills, but we have to build those skills, and that means the grown-ups have to build those skills. And you don't just build those skills by holding them at bay.
Right.
Okay? So that's one level of the answer. The other level of the answer is that one of the things that I think it's profound, and there's a beautiful blog piece about this I have bookmarked somewhere. Someone wrote a couple of months ago, if the news is important enough, it will come and find me. In other words, it will arrive via my social network. Okay. So if I hadn't woken up this morning to find out that George Carlin had passed, I would have known first thing this morning because Mika made a comment about it during the opening of PDF, and other people have been talking about it or blogging about it and all this thing all day long. So that news, which is important to people who are sort of left of center politically, because he was a left of center political comedian, sure. not entirely, but certainly part of his career. Mm-hmm. That news found me very quickly. And other types of news would find me very quickly because of the circles that I associate in.
And you want to be found. That's the thing. You
want
it to come to you. Or do you not?
No, I mean, I certainly, I'm not sure that there's, short of putting yourself into a coffin, I'm not sure how you can avoid having it find you. We're all, neighbors talk to each other, they gossip, they tell each other stories. So this is an antique behavior. This is a behavior that has no sort of, it started at such and such a date. It's coming in through more channels now. But there's nothing qualitatively different than two neighbors talking over the back fence about what may have happened at City Hall last week, and that was going on in New England 200 years ago.
So the difference now is that conversation is mostly virtual for a lot of people.
Well, and it's also a hyper-connected conversation where it's not just two individuals, but it's two individuals and then fully connected to their social networks, which number in the multitudes.
And that's the thing, is that when people sort of sit down and we live in a very complex world. If you look at the politics right now, everybody's saying that what's happening in the United States, it's about policy. How do we find a clarity within that? Because if every person is sort of doing their own thing, where is that sort of idea, perhaps a 21st century idea of sort of the public square?
I think we're being thrown to ourselves. We're looking to ourselves, and we're looking to ourselves and the bonds of affinity to be able to get things done. And the question which always arises is, how does that scale into a highway system or a public health system or things like that, or even a school system? And we're going to have to negotiate that, because I don't think there are any easy answers. But to say that we need the public square so that people can come to agreement on things, yes, but the question then is, well, once you've come to agreement, where are you referring that agreement to? In other words, that it always seems to imply an executive, and I think that the executive has become too informationally pressured to be responsive. The executive as an archetype is being deformed by the number of pressures that are being placed on it by hyperconnectivity.
Sure. I think that that's largely a good thing. Again, to me, it's empowerment for individuals and citizens around the world. But I guess what my question is how do we form aggregates of meaning within that? Right. I'm not necessarily saying that we need an executive at the end of the day to sort of make that decision or define sort of a highway of policy, but the question is, if everybody is contributing, I think what I'm saying is, where do we look for standards of meaning that even if we set them? I think that's the thing a lot of people are confused with.
One of the things that I think, and I'm trying to bring it back into the discussion, I will be doing it very strongly, I think, in the book. One of the things that I think we've neglected to remember, because it's omnipresent and we don't think about it, is the inherent idea of trust. That I am willing to join you in debate, in discussion, in a public forum, because there is a level of trust between us. If there is no level of trust between us, then it will spiral. It becomes, Usenet. It becomes raving blog, and it falls apart. It's because there's no trust, there's no respect. This is the thing that is one of the interesting points about the difference between the social network that's in our heads versus the one that's on our pages in Facebook. I carry 150 people around with me. These people, I know them well enough to know how not to hurt them, right? Or if I want to be deliberate, if I'm angry, I could deliberately hurt them. But what I know is there's that trust relationship there, which is constantly reinforced. And I know them enough to love them enough to not to hurt them.
Okay.
And that, it seems to me, that's the baseline for the public discourse, whether you're in the 18th century or you're in the 21st century, that there has to be that assumption of good faith and trust, and that if you can't get there, you could never, no matter the technological basis, you could never have that conversation.
Okay. One of the things I'm also curious about is how do you view the increasing corporate control of the internet? Even the idea of censorship, is this something, are you seeing signs of that increasing? Is that something that over time you're becoming more worried about? Because again, we have such a free flow of information, but corporate interests have very strong interests in the web going in certain directions.
Right.
And that could, of course, disempower, individuals.
Right.
How do you look at that?
There's a lovely rule, Gilmore's Law. So John Gilmore, founder of Sun, founder of Cygnus Software, founder of the EFF, came up with this rule in '93, which is that the net regards censorship as a failure and routes around it. Now, even at the time, he didn't mean it as the routing equipment. It's not boxes and wires. It's the people who are the net. And the name of the book is going to be The Human Network, because that's really what it's about. Okay. And so whenever there's a block that's artificial, in some sense, it's non-inherent, the people who are the actors in this network find a way around it. This is why no matter how tightly you control some piece of media, it ends up being hyper-distributed now. This is why there are no secrets anymore, for good and for ill. And so the idea of censorship, of actually literally constructing the net so that there are tariff ways, or different tariff ways, I think it's actually functionally impossible to make it happen. Now, interestingly, people are talking about metering usage in America, and people are going, I can't believe this. Well, in Australia, that's how we live. We pay for the internet we use. Okay. And so we're going, that actually seems quite reasonable, that if you're using more internet than your neighbors, perhaps you should pay a little bit more. You do that with electricity and water. Okay. And so we don't think of that as being a problem per se. If you're talking about Time Warner providing easier access to their streaming videos than YouTube, which is really, from what I've been reading of analysis, part of what's there. They don't want the competition from loser-generated content. I love that phrase. Ooh, because that right there, because it was that phrase was created by the giants, all right? That tells you how much they misunderstand what's going on here, okay. All right? Because it's not loser-generated content. It's content that is salient to an audience in the tens or the hundreds, but it is so salient to that audience. It doesn't matter that the lighting isn't right and the camera is crooked and that it's not mic'd correctly, and that it's choppy. None of that matters. Okay. All right. But so they're fighting this battle of mass against micro, but the micro is the termites at the foundation there, so they can't ever do that. So if they attempt to pervert it, and it's kind of funny because everyone's sort of locked up in this idea that, well, they're the carriers. If you get the carriers locked up, then you control the net. No, because the network is simply an agreement on how two computers will talk to each other. It doesn't matter what's carried over DSL or carried over my telephone or carried over blah, 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 blah. Mm-hmm. And so you have, okay, if one system becomes difficult, then that really, because of the informational pressure, doesn't go away. And it will build up if it's being blocked. Okay. It will only produce an opening somewhere else, all right? Because the actors, the people involved, will be actively looking for this. This is why no copy protection scheme goes more than a few days without being cracked anymore. Okay. Because when you block something, right, you create a corresponding pressure, and there are millions of people who are interested in sharing information, hypermimesis again, around how to crack it. So I don't worry about it. I think it's stupid. I think it's annoying. I think it's actually fruitless. I think that the record companies still don't understand this. I think that the movie companies don't really understand this either, but they've had an easier go of it because they haven't made most of the same mistakes the recording industry has.
So how would you look at something like piracy, people violating copyrights? Is it sort of on a case-by-case basis? Do you have like sort of a general philosophy in how you look at that?
But the thing of it is that, I mean, remember, there are always different definitions for what constitutes piracy, because if you're copying something and then selling it again, then that's a clear violation of someone else's copyrights. If I'm sharing something with my friends, this is where you get into a gray area. And the law is not completely silent on this, but is fungible on this. And the question is anything, in a culture where we have more media than we know what to do with, is anything so absolutely vital that something else that's freely available over there isn't going to be equally alluring because it's easier to get to? In other words, if you put that barrier up, essentially what's going to happen is you're going to drain your audience away. And this is the new logic. And now what you get to is a situation where the more something is shared, if you make it freely available, potentially the more valuable it becomes.
Right.
And that's a logic that doesn't fit into the need. It's not so much that it doesn't fit into copyright law, it's that it doesn't fit into the tariff distribution models that the copyright holders are using now.
Maybe my last question for you, it's interesting because recently you said that all the bets that we have about the future are off. And at the same time you said that as long as you give them the network, human beings are more than ingenious enough to know what to do with it.
Right.
How do you look at the next 5 to 10 years? Are you generally optimistic? Are you excited?
Oh, very excited.
Yeah, about the changes that are going to come.
Well, what's happening right now, as of, I mean, people are disputing about the exact date, but probably somewhere in March, half of humanity bought a mobile phone. So 3.4 billion people out of the 6.8 billion people on Earth have a mobile phone by around 2011, so that's that time frame. Roughly 5 billion, maybe a little bit more people, 75% of humanity will have a mobile phone. So in the last 10 years, we've gone from half of humanity never having made a phone call to half of humanity owning a mobile phone, which means in general, you know someone. Anywhere in this world, you know someone with a mobile. So the main stage may have nothing to do with America or Australia or Europe or Canada or Japan. The main stage may be, I think it is actually China and India and Africa. What I saw, so May 12th, the Sichuan earthquake happened at 5:30 in the afternoon in Australia. And on Twitter, I have a couple of people who I follow who happen to be in China. And I was going out that evening, and I knew about that earthquake before anyone else in Australia did because I hadn't gone on the AP wire. I went out to this event and talked to some friends who had been to China. They hadn't heard about it. By the time I get home that evening, of course, it's all over the news, and I'm getting news reports directly from the folks in China. For 36 hours, I was better informed than someone who was watching the BBC or reading the New York Times because I had a direct line in. And what I saw out of that direct line is that China, a nation with now 575 million cell phones, has a level of connectivity inside of it, which made, I mean, people were under collapsed buildings, and while their batteries were lasting, they were calling, going, "Hi, get me out of here, I'm under a collapsed building." Yeah. And I saw Twitter being used as a clearinghouse. Hey, you're in this town, could you check to see if my relatives are okay? So it was, and apparently this happened last year as well during the fires in San Diego, which were quite close to where my sister lives. So that these hyperconnectivity resources can snap. You know, Twitter's normally inane, but eventually it can just snap and be, oh wait, we're connected together and we need to use this for something because we're human beings trying to help each other do this thing. And those moments are going to become more and more frequent, and they're going to become now part of the continuum, the background continuum of what it means to be a human in the 21st century. So am I optimistic? Yeah, I'm optimistic. It's going to be really interesting because there's going to be very weird other things that happen too. None of this has been expected. None of this has been predicted. So not all of it's going to be pretty, but there are these beautiful moments, and they're going to be there too.
Very good. Well, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
All right, and thanks for joining us. We'll see you again soon.